So yeah, I work at O'Reilly Media. The two primary things that I do there are our Strata RX conference on data science and healthcare, and this thing we just launched about 6 months ago called the Data Sensing Lab. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But so this is what I do a lot of the time. And this is what I've been doing a lot for the last 6 months. This photo was actually from about 2 weeks ago when the Data Sensing Lab team rolled 525 Arduino-based sensor modes at Google I/O. Some of you may have seen that. And we had previously done about 40 or 50 hand-soldered sensor modes at a time. 525 is a lot different. And Matt, if you think it's bad to fly with one accelerometer, try flying with 500 of these suckers. But today, what I'm going to do is this, because somehow I let myself be talked into giving a talk about the far future of sensors. And whenever you talk about the future of technology, this is what you end up looking like. Because there's just no way to do it without looking really, really wrong. So just so you understand the company I'm about to put myself in, I thought I would show you a few other examples of predictions about the future of technology. Some of you may have seen these before. There's a set of sort of French postcards that came out in 1900 and 1910 predicting what the future of technology would be like in the year 2000. So this is one. And it turns out that it's actually not that far off, right? This was intensive breeding, they called it. And we do have these machines that you put eggs into and chickens come out, basically. Here's another one about electric scrubbing. And it turns out they sort of got the idea right, but the technology is totally different from what they imagined. Here's another one, a tailor, I guess, and I don't know if any of you have seen these. They basically take the same body monitors that are in the airport scanners and they've put them in department stores. You go in, you get your body scanned, and they tell you which jeans to buy. So we basically have that. This was the rural postman. This one ended up being totally wrong, right? We do get mail through the air, but in a different way. And I think this is one of the last ones I have for you. This is at school. And today we know this as massively open online courses. So, oh, right, this one, last one, the newfangled barber. I think we all know how this one turned out, right? Maybe not. Right, so what's interesting about all these, if you take a closer look at them, and I hope you will, is that when we gaze into our crystal ball about the future of technology, we tend to just see a distortion of our present reflected back at us. And this makes it really difficult. Some of the predictions made errors of degree, right? Some made errors of kind. And some were wrong in the sense that really nothing has changed at all in 100 years. We still go to the barber pretty much the same way we always have. So this is the challenge that I'm facing when I agree to talk about the future of technology. The thing is, some people have begun to imagine the far future of data sensing, and Mark actually laid the groundwork for me perfectly with this by introducing you to this, Smart Dust. How many of you are familiar with Smart Dust, by the way? Okay, not very many. Exciting stuff, I get to tell you. So this is Professor Chris Piester. He's at the UC Berkeley. You may have seen his name go by briefly in Mark's slides. I think he's the one who actually coined the term. If he didn't actually coin it, he's certainly the one who made it a serious consideration. And this was in the 1990s, the early 1990s. In 1997-98, he actually got DARPA funding to start working on Smart Dust. And the idea was that you could take the sensor motes that Mark showed you, that were about the size of cell phones, and you could actually reduce them in size, first like this, and then with the end goal being getting them down to something like that. And so, as I say, Professor Piester, with a number of other co-investigators, worked on this with DARPA funding, and by 2006, they'd actually gotten sensors down to about the size of a grain of rice. This is actually a photo of a chip antenna that came out in 2007, so this is not their actual sensor, but it gives you an idea of the scale that we're at. And the idea is that by 20 years into the future, we'll have them so small they'll actually be dust-sized, and we can just blow sensors everywhere. So when we talk about sensor networks, the current sort of name for the phenomenon is the Internet of Things. That's the one that's popular right now. But there have been other names for the movement, and those include machine-to-machine technology, or M2M. The other name, the one that I like the best, is ubiquitous computing. And I like this one best because, in my mind, it gets at the heart of the sea change that this movement is bringing. Because sure, we can connect a bunch of things to the internet, big deal. Well, it is a big deal, but the hubbub is not so much about connecting things to the internet, it's about putting computers everywhere. Think about it, right? We feel like we're surrounded by computers right now. A lot of people in this room probably have 3 or 4 on them if you've got your laptop and your e-reader and your cell phone. And we know that, computers run things like our traffic lights and our elevators. So we're aware that they're around us a lot, but imagine if there were a computer in literally every object in your house and in your office and in your neighborhood. Imagine that there were computers in the wind. Imagine they were literally ubiquitous, and that would really be something. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about smart dust, computers everywhere. Okay, but we need to hold on a second here, right? You remember the series of French predictions about the year 2000. So there's this other series of German ones put out as promotions by the Hildebrand Chocolate Company, and they mostly have to do with transportation, and in some ways they're really short-sighted and ridiculous. This is my favorite one. At first, I thought this was the dumbest one of all of them. Others imagine personal flying machines, and this one just wants us to promenade on water. What's up with the horse? It's like we can walk on water, but we still need a horse to pull the carriage. But look closely at what's happening here, right? They began with this premise that we want to walk on water, and the means they envision to achieve that feat are a combination of technologies that were already known to them, right? So namely boats and hot air balloons, only smaller. So the boats became shoes, the hot air balloons became buoys, and to me, and maybe to you, this is really ridiculous, but because if I wanted to walk on water, I'd just do that. But they didn't have jet lev, they had balloons and they had boats, so they took what they knew, they made it smaller, they put them together. Makes sense, right? But I see that, and then I see people talking about the sensors we have today. Some of them are pretty sophisticated, and people talk about making them small and putting them together, and I think, that can't be right. That can't be what the future is really going to look like. So again, going back to Mark setting me up perfectly, I think about sensor modes the same way I think about cell phones. There was this kind of game changer, right? This mobile phone. Instead of having a phone in your house, you could take it with you everywhere. But it wasn't really game changer because it was heavy and you were still tethered and it had this giant battery you had to lug around. So this wasn't really the game changer, right? This was the game changer, the internet in your pocket. And I had to go through a whole bunch of iterations to get there, right? It didn't happen overnight, had to evolve. So this is kind of the same path we're on with sensors, right? This is one of the custom PCBs that we deployed at Google I/O. It's got, pressure, temperature, humidity, light, noise, air quality. And this is not the game changer, it's the precursor to the game changer. Smart dust, or the beginnings of it, are a step along the way. But what we're going to end up with, what the ultimate sort of amazing thing is going to change the way we live, I don't really know yet. I don't think anybody knows. Will it actually be smart dust? It might be, but it's probably going to do things we can't even dream about yet, in the same way that the Victorians never dreamed about jet lev. But sometimes you can predict the what, even if you can't predict the how. So the Germans, in their postcard series, basically got the walking on water idea, even if they totally missed the means. And in addition to jet lev, they basically predicted Netflix, right, and Amazon, this downtown that comes to you. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is skip over the bit where I look like a complete idiot by attempting to predict the how of the future, and I'm just going to leave out the means. So I want to share with you a few things that I believe about the what of the future of sensors. So thing one, we will measure, not calculate. This seems boring on first blush, but think about all the kinds of information that we currently approximate or guess at or pull and sample and then calculate. In the future of sensors, we aren't going to calculate. We're going to measure. We're going to know. Why does this matter? Well, most of you probably heard the quote that you can't manage what you can't measure. It's usually attributed to this gentleman, W. Edwards Deming, a statistician and professor, although he had never actually said that. What he did say is the most important figures that one needs for management are unknown or unknowable, but successful management must nevertheless take account of them. So there are some things that sensors won't help us measure, like human motivations, but for the most part, they're going to bring into the realm of the knowable all kinds of things that we couldn't know before, and this will help us better manage our world and ourselves. Deming wasn't saying that you can't manage what you can't measure. He was saying that even though you can't measure it, you still have to find a way to manage it. Sensors are going to give us better ways to manage those things. So here are the sensor modes, the 4 different types that we deployed at Google I/O. We had 4 different kinds of boards, and you'll see the ones in the lower right have those air quality sensors on them. They're actually measuring volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. It turns out that interior air quality is one of those things that's typically not measured. It's typically calculated based on exterior air quality modified by some magic algorithm corresponding to the air scrubbers that you're using. And so what we did was we actually measured, and importantly, we measured close to the ground, not 20 feet up where the air vents are. And we found a high correlation between foot traffic, which you can see on the bottom there, and air quality deterioration, which you can see on the top, during the conference, which is really no surprise when you have 6,000 people walking across, newly laid exhibitor carpeting, kicking up all kinds of chemicals and then dropping food crumbs. But to measure that in real time and watch the air quality kind of recover after the foot traffic dropped off when people got settled in their talk rooms was really enlightening and really cool. Here's another thing that we can begin to measure that we'd previously calculated. There was a bridge over the Skagit River in Washington State that collapsed about a week and a half ago, and when it did, Mike Wheatley wrote a great piece for SiliconANGLE about smart bridges and infrastructure sensors. Right now, most of our nation's aging freeways and bridges are monitored by people, by engineers who go out and check, make sure they're okay. But there just aren't enough engineers to go around. Some of the world's newer bridges are being built with sensors inside. Here's an example. This is meant to be put inside poured concrete. And these sensors can measure vibrations and other things and detect when there's a potential problem, ideally saving lives. But these are still pretty big and they're expensive, so you don't have them everywhere. You just kind of disperse them throughout the bridge, and then when they detect a problem, an engineer or human still has to come out and figure out exactly where the problem is. So the idea is that in the future, these sensors will shrink, hopefully so small we can put them in paint and just paint them on bridges and freeways and things. And these are going to save lives. One more example of measuring instead of calculating. Air quality in bridges are one thing, but people are another thing that we're going to be able to measure. This is going to further the field that's becoming known as precision medicine. So right now, we have drugs that work, for example, we say they work 80% of the time. In many cases, that's not actually true. They work 100% of the time for 80% of the people. The problem is you just don't know for a given patient whether they're in the 80% or not. But with sensors and other kinds of technology that are allowing us to divide ourselves into smaller and smaller cohorts, smaller and smaller demographic groups, the idea is eventually we'll reach a demographic of 1, and we'll be able to know exactly which interventions work for which people. That's big stuff. Okay, so we're going to measure, not calculate. Number 2, we're going to expect to know everything. There's a caveat to this, which I'll get to in a moment, but for now, let's think about how knowing everything will change us. We already know that our memories operate on a use it or lose it basis. So the consequence of having the internet, the sum total of information that represents in our pockets at our fingertips, is that we're changing our brains physically. Yet even with all that we currently have access to, there's still a lot that we don't know, and sensors are going to add to that. So we're going to know more than ever, and we're going to remember less. That's one interesting consequence. But who will do the knowing? I specifically framed this point as we will expect to know everything, because I believe we will eventually come to the point where nearly everything is knowable, but who will know it is still an open question. Right now, the information from the sensors we already have is largely locked away in proprietary silos. So your cell phone company has it, and municipal governments have it. Nike or Fitbit or the company that made your pacemaker have it. I think that things are this way mostly because we're still default to expecting not to know. But as that changes, the movement's already afoot to liberate data from these silos will only intensify, and we will expect, as citizens, to know. And this raises an interesting question. What happens when we don't know? One of my colleagues in the data sensing lab, Alistair Allen, gave a talk at Strata London last fall where he said this: in the near future, the absence of data about you, about your location, is going to be increasingly unusual. Innocent until proven guilty is a core tenet in our legal system, but it came from an age that was data poor. We no longer live in that age. So what happens when we don't know? Will we move from reasonable doubt to reasonable suspicion? Will the absence of information become reason to think there's wrongdoing? Here's the caveat I mentioned earlier to this: we will expect to know everything. Another colleague of mine, Alex Howard, wrote that data on its own, locked up or muddled with errors, does little good. Cleaned up, structured, analyzed, and layered into stories, which John talked about a lot, data can enhance our understanding of the most basic questions about our world, helping journalists to explain who, what, where, how, and why changes are happening. I think these are important. Sensors are going to tell us a lot about who, what, and where. The how and why are still difficult and human-centric questions, and those are going to be the important stories to tell. So we will expect to know everything, but the how and the why we have to figure out. Okay, finally, we will expect to know everything now, instantly. There's virtue in delayed gratification, right? How many of you are familiar with this Marshmallow Study? This is one of my favorite studies. Okay, most of you, but in short, they did an experiment where they took young children and said, here's a marshmallow, you can eat it now, or if you don't touch it for the next 5 minutes, when I come back, I'll give you a second marshmallow and you can eat them both then. And then they watched to see which children had enough self-control or the ability to delay gratification long enough that they could get the second marshmallow, and then they followed those children over the courses of their lives to see if they did better in school, if they got better jobs, if they lived longer. And it turns out that yes, the ability to delay gratification is a really important skill. But there are times when delay can do us great harm, and that is, most notably, when we're trying to learn. Feedback loops are incredibly important when it comes to learning and behavior change. Anyone who's tried to train children or pets knows this very well. The farther that you separate the action from the effect or the consequence of that action, the harder it is for humans and animals to learn. So part of the reason that these are so dangerous is that their feedback loop is sometimes 60 years long. Even though we know cognitively that they're terrible for us, we don't get that feedback, that consequence, for a long, long time. The feedback loop on these is a lot shorter, but still too long for most people. And worse, the positive actions we can take to combat these harmful things also have long feedback loops. So here's where I get to the part where I defend the quantified self movement. This is the community of people who are interested in, or in many cases obsessed with, measuring and quantifying their own habits, such as sleeping, eating, and exercising. Some people have poo-pooed this movement as this technology enabling the ultimate form of narcissism. But in my view, the brilliance of this movement is that it shortens that feedback loop, right? So they found a way using sensors to shorten the feedback loop on our most basic behaviors, which allow us to learn and then change those behaviors. Want to know what else has a really long feedback loop? This does. And that does. So quantified self is great, but what I'm really excited about is quantified planet. Smart dust, or whatever its actual future is going to make this possible. It's going to let us learn the hard lessons and change our behaviors in the most critical ways. The Germans thought that by the year 2000, we'd already have machines to help us control the weather. And yet climate change looms larger than ever, so we have a lot of learning to do. Here's the kicker. We're not the only ones who can learn. Computers learn too, and the more data that we can collect, the better we can teach them, or in many cases, they can teach themselves. So all jokes about the Terminator aside, it turns out computer learning is a really good thing. And just like the Roomba sure beats the maid with a broom on a pulley, smart machines are going to make our lives better in ways that we can't imagine yet. So, if you listen to some of the television reports about smart dust, they are kind of amusing. They say things like, smart dust on the train tracks can tell you when your train is going to be running late. And this is, to me, delightfully short-sighted because it assumes that we're going to continue to wait for trains as we always have. The beauty of smart dust and other sensors is that it can turn all that on its head, right? So perhaps instead of telling us when the train is late, it will tell the train system when there's a gathering quorum of passengers on the platform and we can speed along a train to accommodate the passengers. This is a small example, but sensors won't just tell us more about the way we're already living. They're going to change the way we live. What will the future actually look like? How will sensors help us measure things so that we can better manage our lives ourselves? What stories will we tell about the how and the why? I can't tell you yet, but I'm waiting for you all to tell me.